The 1905 revolution had commenced in December 1904 and faded out in 1907. Quote, "The struggle was really a prolonged civil war, a series of spontaneous outbursts against the stupid brutalities of a despot and his officials who could as little understand the times in which they lived as a caveman could understand the calculus." Murphy. The Tsar would make concessions when pressure was applied, only to take them away when the situation calmed down. New parties emerged, including the Liberal Cadet Party, originally known as the Constitutional Democratic Party, the Octoberist Party, referencing the date of the Tsar's manifesto, and the Union of the Russian People, who supported the autocracy. The latter visited the Tsar, wanting to find out what his intent was with the manifesto, and he assured them he had not abandoned autocracy. Quote, "The Union of the Russian People went on its way, and organized the Black Hundreds for conducting pogroms, especially against the Jews. This organization was really a forerunner of the Nazi Party, having much in common with what has become known as Nazism and fascism." Ibid. The day after the manifesto was published, over 100 pogroms were carried out, and thousands of people were murdered. There were many punitive expeditions, and the Black Hundreds were assisting the police and military. On May 10, 1906, the First Duma, Parliament, elected on an indirect suffrage, met in St. Petersburg. The new Prime Minister told the delegates, quote, "Any attempt to alter the imperial view will be quite useless and only dangerous to you." Ibid. The Duma was dissolved in under a few weeks. Stolypin, a new minister, wanted to restore order via violent repression and reform. He imprisoned most members of the First Duma, quote, "set up field courts-martial, organized punitive expeditions on a large scale, and introduced under Article 87 a reform law for the peasants." Ibid. He had gotten rid of the Duma that brought him to power, and now wanted to hold another restricted election, while he prepared a law that would restrict it even more after dealing with the Second Duma. A police conspiracy helped lead to the demise of the latter. 65 Social Democrats were elected to the Second Duma, which met on March 5, 1907. This was too many for the police, who claimed to have discovered a plan between the Social Democrats and Social Revolutionaries to assassinate the Tsar. It came out later that this was a massive fraud, but the Duma was dissolved on June 3rd, and the 65 Social Democratic members were exiled to Siberia. Quote, "The new electoral law was then promulgated. It abolished all semblance of universal suffrage and placed the elections almost entirely in the hands of the country gentry." Ibid. In the fall of 1907, only 18 of the 442 members elected to the Third Duma were Social Democrats. It ended in 1912, when the Fourth Duma, which included 6 Bolsheviks and 7 Mensheviks, was elected. They were eventually sent to prisons in Siberia, and the Fourth Duma came to an end in the October Revolution of 1917. Even though the workers had secured the 10-hour day, the right to form unions, and some amount of freedom of speech and press, workdays everywhere were extended to 12 hours, wages were cut 10 to 15%, and unions were repressed by 1908. During the 1905 revolution, quote, "the workers and peasants fought tenaciously until well beaten." Ibid. In 1905, there were around 14,000 strikes and 2.9 million strikers. In 1906, there were about 6,100 strikes and 2.1 million strikers. In 1907, there were around 3,600 strikes and 740,000 strikers. 1,692 death sentences were given the same year, and the press reported 748 carried out. 3,074 people were deported in the provinces of Tiflis and Kutai. These numbers don't include the field courts-martial or the punitive expeditions, which killed thousands. Quote, "Thus the unplanned revolutionary wave and the counter-revolutionary measures of the Tsar's officials left much wreckage of the young social democratic labor movement on the fields of battle." Ibid. Thousands of people were dead, wounded, in prison, or in Siberian exile. Due to the actions of the cadets, social revolutionaries, and Narodniks, the RSDLP was viewed as the only party with any appeal to the working class. Of course, they were now divided into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, and each wanted a majority over the other. The Bolsheviks wanted even more to build the party as Lenin had described it in What Is to Be Done. Lenin and Stalin used the 1905 revolution as a learning experience. Quote, They were convinced that the 1905 revolution was but the prologue to a greater and more far-reaching revolt, and they wanted the working class to be better equipped without delay. Ibid. The bourgeoisie had come close to seizing power, but were unable to, and had joined with czarist forces. The working class had advanced, but the struggles of the 1905 revolution were spontaneous, and lacked a singular direction. The workers and peasants had also not been united. In his January 1906 article, Two Conflicts, Koba wrote, quote, "What the victory of the uprising demands is a united party, an armed uprising organized by the party, and a policy of attack." Ibid. In April 1906, the party held a conference in Stockholm, the first all-Russian conference that Koba attended. There were 111 voting delegates. Of the 11 delegates from Georgia, Koba was the only Bolshevik. It was called a unity conference, but this was a bit of a misnomer. The differences between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks were too great, but Lenin didn't want to push it and establish a separate party until his ideas were taken up more by the rest of the party, and he wanted to, quote, "secure a majority in the local organizations, the party central machinery, and the party newspaper before the split should come." Ibid. So he used the conference to drive home what they'd learned from the recent experiences, and show the party and workers the different policies of the two groups in practice. As Murphy wrote, quote, "The more the Mensheviks defended their position, the more clearly they revealed themselves." Ibid. They thought Social Democrats should unite with liberals, as capitalist democracy must come before socialism. Koba summed up the issue by saying, quote, "Either the hegemony of the proletariat or the hegemony of the democratic bourgeoisie. That is how the question stands in the party. That is where we differ." Ibid. On this point, the Bolsheviks were defeated. They were in the minority, and many of their local organizations had been destroyed. Then they moved to the land question. Lenin said it was time for the land to be nationalized, which could only happen if the czarist regime was overthrown. He wanted the peasants, united with the workers, to rise up against the czar and the landlords. The Mensheviks opposed this, calling for a program of municipalization, where the peasants would rent land from their local authority. The Bolsheviks refused to support this, but the Mensheviks had the majority. Joseph's position was that the land should be seized and shared directly among the peasants. He called it distributism, and it was to be a temporary measure. This was what the peasants wanted, and would win their support, but Lenin and others attacked it. He stood his ground. Quote, and, according to Gray, in 1917, his policy, by then endorsed by Lenin, produced the slogan, "All land to the peasants," which gained the party-wide support on the land and was a major factor in its victory. It was now time for the question of whether the party should participate in the Duma. The Mensheviks saw the Duma as the first step in the democratic revolution and welcomed it, while the Bolsheviks regarded it as an appendage of the government. The Bolsheviks had boycotted the first Duma, but Lenin decided to participate in the next, so they could use the elections and Duma itself to rouse the workers and peasants to revolution. Some Bolsheviks abstained from voting on this, including Koba. He had written articles in March talking about distributing land to the peasants and boycotting the Duma. Quote, "His stand against Lenin on both issues was thus not for effect, as a gesture of independence, or to establish himself in the eyes of party comrades. He was acting consistently and apparently without thought for his popularity or advancement." Gray. He would eventually change his mind on the Duma question, though. The Congress also banned expropriation, robbery. Quote, "The Mensheviks, still led by Plekhanov and Martov, deplored the fact that the workers had taken up arms." Murphy. The Bolsheviks held that the problem was the workers' lack of arms and preparation, and that they had fought defensively. Quote, "The Mensheviks outvoted the Bolsheviks and secured a majority on the executive committee and the editorial board of the party's newspaper, Iskra." Ibid. Quote, "He, Lenin, told Lunacharsky that he would never allow the Mensheviks to lead us along after them on a chain." Gray. It wasn't all bad, though. This was where Koba first met Voroshilov, who he would have a lasting friendship with. According to Murphy, quote, "He was a Bolshevik delegate from the Ukraine, young, vital, already a leader of strikes. He differed from Stalin in many respects, being round-faced and fair, merry-eyed, always ready for mischief and fun, whereas Stalin was oval-faced, black-haired, swarthy, rather somber in disposition, and possessed of a sardonic humor, but equally vital. They had a lot in common in addition to their devotion to Lenin. Not long after, Voroshilov visited Koba in Baku, where they, along with Koba's close friend and fellow Georgian, Sergo Ordzhonikidze, firmly established the Bolsheviks among the oil workers there. Quote, as soon as Stalin returned, he became the recognized leader of the Bolsheviks in Transcaucasia, and a regional bureau was formed under his leadership to do battle with the Mensheviks. Ibid. He wrote a pamphlet explaining the conference in Stockholm called The Present Situation in the Unity Conference of the Workers' Party, as well as articles in the newspaper Elva, which was unfortunately taken by the police when they found the Alva Bar press. The point of this campaign was to win over Social Democrats to the Bolsheviks and achieve a majority in the local organizations. Quote, the debates with the Mensheviks were to him as much a part of the war against Tsardom as a conflict with the police, and far more important. Ibid. On July 16, 1906, at 2 a.m., Joseph married a woman named Ekaterina Svanidze, nicknamed Kato. Her younger brother, Alexander, aka Alyosha, was a fellow member of the RSDLP, Bolsheviks, and a friend of Joseph's. He had invited Joseph to live with him, his three sisters, and his brother-in-law in 1905, and Joseph and Kato hit it off. Kato, newly pregnant when they married, was religious, and wanted a church wedding, which Joseph agreed to. It was difficult to find a priest who would do the ceremony, given Joseph had to use fake documents, but a classmate of his from the seminary agreed to do it, as long as it was done at night. Joseph would later tell his daughter, Svetlana, that Kato was, quote, very sweet and beautiful. She melted my heart. Montefiore. She felt much the same way about him. She was an educated woman and supporter of the Bolsheviks, who put together fundraisers for the party and helped wounded comrades. She hosted a contact from Moscow in November 1906, but unfortunately this contact was a double agent. After he left, Kato and her cousin were arrested on November 13th. Her cousin was given a death sentence for making bombs, but this was later commuted to a lesser sentence. Kato was released after 6 weeks in prison, partially due to her pregnancy, but had to stay at the police chief's house for 2 months. Joseph visited her there often, as the officers did not recognize him. Both Joseph and his mother were present when Kato gave birth to a son, Iakob, on March 18, 1907. Joseph managed to find time to play with his son, who he called Patsan, Laddie, Sunni. Joseph, Kato, and Iakob fled to Baku a few months after the latter's birth to avoid arrest, after Joseph was involved in a Tiflis bank robbery. In May 1907, there was a party congress in the Brotherhood Church in London. There were 336 delegates, and the Bolsheviks held a majority on every issue. Describing the clothing of the attendees, Gray wrote, quote, some delegates, like Plekhanov, wore dark tailcoats and looked like respectable bankers, while the Russian worker delegates were mostly bearded and wearing Russian blouses. Others from the Ukraine and the Caucasus were exotic and romantic in their tall sheepskin hats. Martov and the Mensheviks criticized Lenin for continuing with expropriations, but he ignored the attack. Stalin wrote and published a report on the Congress called Notes of a Delegate. In it, he said, quote, the London Congress helped considerably to further the unification and consolidation of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. That is the first important result of the London Congress. The Congress ended in a victory for Bolshevism, a victory of revolutionary social democracy over Menshevism, the opportunist wing of our party. From henceforward, therefore, the party will pursue a strictly class policy of the socialist proletariat. The red banner of the proletariat will no longer be lowered before the liberal spellbinders. Intellectualist vacillation, so unbecoming to the proletariat, has received a mortal blow. That is the second, and no less important, result of the London Congress of our party. Tisko, who represented the Polish delegation, said that both sides of the party, quote, assure us that they firmly stand by the Marxist view, and not everybody will find it easy to determine which of them, after all, does stand by the Marxist view, the Bolsheviks or the Mensheviks. Several Mensheviks interrupted, it is we who stand by the Marxist view. Tisko responded, no, comrades, you do not stand by, but lie down on, the Marxist view. For your helplessness in leading the class struggle of the proletariat, The fact that you are able to learn by heart the great words of the great Marx, but unable to apply them in practice, prove this beyond room for doubt. Murphy. This was one of Joseph's favorite moments from the Congress. At this Congress, Koba saw Trotsky for the first time. Murphy wrote of the latter, quote, "He was too busy fighting Lenin. He was opposing the Bolsheviks and had quarreled also with the Mensheviks. He tried to form a group of his own, to secure, he said, a united party by reconciling the differences. But these differences were not reconcilable." Gray, an anti-communist historian, described him by saying, quote, "Trotsky was vain, prickly, and overbearing," and, quote, "Trotsky was generally disliked for his arrogant, patronizing manner." The first Commissar of Education, Anatoly Lunacharsky, wrote about his, Trotsky's, colossal arrogance and inability or unwillingness to show any human kindness or to be attentive to people. Ibid. Around the end of the Congress was when the 65 Social Democratic members of the Duma were exiled to Siberia, and the Stolypin reaction was underway. People were killed via hanging, dubbed the Stolypin necktie, and firing squads, and working-class organizations were destroyed. The liberal springtime had gone away, and depression set in among Social Democrats. 150,000 members were in the RSDLP at the beginning of 1907, but they now numbered only a few thousand. The depressed mood affecting the leaders led to a variety of opinions on policy, quote, even to decrying the revolution and pleading for the liquidation of the party and the revision of Marxism. Murphy. Speaking on this period long after, T. Dan, a Menshevik opponent of the Bolsheviks, wrote, quote, whilst the Bolshevik section of the party transformed itself into a battle phalanx, held together by iron discipline and cohesive guiding resolutions, the ranks of the Menshevik section became ever more seriously disorganized by dissension and apathy. Ibid. Koba did not become disorganized or depressed, and where Bolshevik organization had been destroyed, he would renew it. By this point, the party's funds were nearly gone, as they weren't getting the financial support they once had from sympathizers. According to Murphy, quote, unless something out of the ordinary were done, the party would be paralyzed. Krasin, the party financier, called on Stalin to solve the problem. Simon Ter-Petrosian, a loyal friend of Joseph's from childhood, and who Joseph had tutored in Russian, whom he nicknamed Camo, was his assistant in organizing partisan groups in the Caucasus. He had an impressive record of arrests and escapes, having been brought to the gallows twice, and even being forced to dig his own grave. He always managed to get out of it somehow. Quote, Camo was the leading spirit of the group Stalin organized for the job of holding up the treasury carriage carrying 250,000 rubles under escort from a Tiflis post office to the state bank in another part of the city. Ibid. They did so on the morning of June 25, 1907, with the aid of explosives, and a police uniform disguise in Camo's case. 2 policemen and some of the Cossacks who had been escorting the carriage apparently ended up dead, and some passers-by were wounded. Around 6 months later, Maxim Litvinov, who eventually became famous for his diplomatic genius, was arrested for trying to exchange some of their money for foreign currency in Paris, and a few other people were arrested in other countries for the same reason. This event led to an outcry, though it was political and not moral. The Russian Empire was a brutal place. The Mensheviks, and even some Bolsheviks, denounced Joseph and the perpetrators as supporters of individual robbery. But this was a desperate measure, one only taken because of the desperate situation. Koba was trying to keep the party from dying. In the future, a street, a hospital, and multiple nurseries in Tiflis would be named after Camo, quote, in memory of a man who was the hero of many revolutionary adventures and accomplished much for the Russian Revolution. Ibid. The village of Camo, Armenia, was also named after him. Koba went back to Baku and led the Baku Worker, along with Voroshilov and Ordzhonikidze, and began a campaign for leadership of the workers. They beat the Mensheviks, and Voroshilov became the head of the Oil Workers Union, which grew to the point that the owners requested a meeting with it. The Mensheviks were divided on the question of accepting the meeting, but in the Baku Worker, Koba said, quote, yes, on conditions, recognition of the union, free election of delegates, and a free press. Ibid. The vast majority of workers agreed with this, and the Bolsheviks became the head of the Shop Stewards Council. Ordzhonikidze said, quote, "While all over Russia black reaction was raging, a genuine workers' parliament was in session in Baku." Gray. A long struggle ensued between the oil workers and their employers, and Koba played a large role. Quote, "He succeeded in making the district a strong center of political activity, which grew continuously throughout the period of reaction, when the rest of the country seemed to be overcome and demoralized." Murphy. Kato eventually became ill, and her family suggested that she move back to Russia to recover, but she was reluctant to leave. Her condition worsened by October, and a concerned Joseph brought her back to Tiflis, though he had to return to Baku. Apparently, on the 13-hour trek, Kato likely contracted typhus from contaminated water and started to hemorrhage blood from her bowels in Tiflis. Joseph was able to visit her once. Unfortunately, she died on November 22, 1907. At 9 a.m. on November 25th, a funeral was held for her in the same church where she had married Joseph. He was devastated. Later on, he apparently told a girlfriend that he, quote, "was so overcome with grief that his comrades took his gun away from him." Kotkin. Supposedly, it has been reported that he threw himself into her grave and had to be pulled out. Because Akhrana, secret police, agents had followed him, he had to leave before the service ended. He left Iakob in the care of Kato's family and departed from Tiflis for Baku. He reportedly did not visit his son for several years, with Montefiore suggesting it was because he reminded him of Kato and her death. A local party court attempted to try Joseph in connection with the looting of the steamship Nicholas I in Baku. A worker claimed the Bolsheviks were responsible. The hearings were interrupted on March 25, 1908, when he was arrested by the police for, quote, "leading a subversive revolutionary organization," Gray, and taken to Bylov prison. His sentence was 8 months in prison plus 3 years of exile at Solvykhodsk in Siberia. The prison had been built to hold 400, but now contained about 1,500. The last time he had been in prison was relatively mild, but due to the reaction, things were getting worse and the rules more strict. The police would plant agents among the prisoners as well. The political prisoners rebelled, and on Easter Sunday 1908, the Smolensk regiment was brought in to deal with them. The prisoners were driven between 2 lines of soldiers, who beat them with the butts of their rifles. According to Murphy, quote, "Stalin, with head erect and carrying a book under his arm, marched unflinchingly under the rain of blows."